Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. I know there are a lot of good sessions that's going on, and I want to attend those sessions myself, but thanks for taking your time and be here with us. I also realize it's 2 o'clock. Many of you probably just had your lunch, so hopefully we'll keep this one interesting and keep you awake. I'll assess my success towards the end of the session. So today we want to talk about automation, right? Oops, I think this one.
Oh, there.
There we go. All right, sorry about that. So today I want to talk about automation, right? So some of you probably already attended a big theme for this Edge conference is DevOps. So you probably already attended some session about API and DevOps. So what we want to talk about today is, I know you already learned a bunch of that. So what we want to talk today about is how do you use some of the existing Akamai tool offhand, then can help you to do the automation at every stage of your development lifecycle. So before we actually start doing this, I want to talk a little bit about the legacy SDLC, right? So those are the, that's in the 90s. That's where the methodology, also people call it waterfall. This is what it is. I think some of you might be familiar with this. I was familiar with this, when I was a developer, right? I'm not that old. But that was the methodology we follow, right? So you have a plan and code, you do the build, you do the test, then eventually you push onto different test environment, do some functional testing, hopefully you do some performance testing, right? Using like low runner or something, limited performance testing. And largely, finally you release it, right, to the world. Now, when you're about to do that, you say, hey, here's Akamai, right? Where's Akamai? There's this Akamai piece I need to take care of. So no one really think about Akamai until everything's done, right? And Akamai say, oh gosh, there's Akamai. So let me push that onto staging, and then I do some testing. Everything works fine, then I push onto production. Okay, so Akamai is there, and mostly it's out of sight, out of band. That's what it was. So move on to the DevOps world. So this is pretty a typical DevOps pipeline, right? So you basically from plan all the way to continuously, the pipeline just runs infinite, and you probably do that a few times a day, right? So where's Akamai fitting here, right? And is Akamai still out of the loop, out of sight, out of band? We hope that's not the case, right? So that's kind of the purpose of this talk. What we will do is we actually going to be introduce a few things, which kind of matches at every stage of the DevOps lifecycle, right? The idea here is you, our customer, can involve us early, and you can really involve us at every stage of your development lifecycle, right? And if you look at these, maybe some of you already recognize some of the terms. You're probably already using it. So what we want to talk about is how do we able to utilize something that's already there and can help you to achieve the automation, right? So with that, I hand it over to Sabrina to talk about development.
So we'll go ahead and break things down to sort of 2 main sections. So we have development and then we have deployment. So as far as development goes, as Eugene mentioned, we want to fit Akamai into different aspects of your development life cycles through APIs. Specifically, we have REST APIs for almost everything. I say almost because we're always adding to whatever we can do today and trying to improve our capabilities. And more importantly, a lot of these APIs can be built into your existing infrastructure. So with the way that you're making changes, coding, releasing, a lot of these APIs can fit into every one of those phases. When it comes to development, just focusing on that aspect, there's 3 main parts that you kind of need. I wanted to summarize the main areas to focus on. There's all sorts of different APIs to use, but when you are setting up, let's say, a test environment, a production environment, and just getting started, you need edge certs, to guarantee that secure connection from the client to the edge. Data center routing. How do you want Akamai's edge to forward traffic to your data centers? And then lastly, HTTPS delivery. That's essentially your edge configuration where you're defining things like caching rules, compression, routing rules, and so on. So these are kind of the 3 main pieces that you need to get things going as far as developing an environment on Akamai. So most importantly, how can we automate any one of these components? And that's with APIs. We have APIs for each one of these, what we would say as critical components in setting up an environment. So for setting up SSL certs, we have two different options, certificate provisioning system API and then secure provisioning service API. I'll talk about some of the difference between the two. For managing traffic to your data centers, you have the traffic manager API. And then for the actual edge configuration and sort of submitting whatever you need to set up an environment, you can use the property manager API. We're going to briefly cover these APIs, but just remember the session isn't teaching you the logistics or the syntax of these APIs, but really how you can fit these together into your development life cycles. So just keep that in mind. Now, I wanted to show you guys just a very standard phased approach when it comes to any sort of change process or any sort of environment work. You'll see references to this very diagram a lot throughout this discussion, and it's very standard. You've got your create, you've got your update, and you've got your deploy phases. And where we really want to focus on is the update and deploy. That's where a lot of the APIs can fit into your sort of everyday needs when it comes to releases on a daily, a weekly, or even a monthly basis. So keeping that in mind, we'll start with SSL certs. Why do we need them? As I mentioned, we want to guarantee secure delivery from the client to the edge. And it's something that is critical for delivering secure traffic on the platform. On top of that, even APIs and portal alike, we can provision certificates using trusted certificate authorities. So once again, not only is it secure, but it's something that you guys can trust when it comes to deploying those certs on the platform. So keeping that in mind, again, referring to this very standard life cycle, when it comes to certificate management, you've got your create, you've got your update, whether it be editing or renewing certs, and then you have your deploy. And it's the update and deploy where the APIs can fit in and to, again, your daily, your weekly changes or your release cycles. So I'll talk about these two APIs, starting off with certificate provisioning system API. As far as that API goes, you have your standard capabilities. You can create certs, you can update certs, and so on. You can make more complex changes like ciphers, really any types of requirements you need for your certs. A couple things to point out is that the API itself, it uses a JSON format. And then when it comes to updating certificates, it's a two-step process. You have to retrieve the current cert, make the changes. Let's say you want to update SAN host names, and then once you do that, you submit the whole certificate changes through the API. So I wanted to call that out because you'll see the difference with the other Edge SSL cert API. But that's the basic kind of concept with this particular API. Now the secure provisioning service API, I like to think of it as a subset of SPS API. And that's because it essentially does what you would need to do when it comes to managing certificates, but maybe not as many options, but it gets you where you need to be, at least when you are setting up an environment end to end. You can create certs, you can update certs. The update here is a one-step process, so it does fit a little simpler in terms of getting that in an automated way into your development life cycles. It does use a different format, uses URL form encoding. And then lastly, one thing I do want to mention about this API is it allows you to create edge host names. We know why edge host names are needed, right? Yes. Okay, good. Edge host names is what essentially ties your host names to our platform by creating that CNAME record. And with that edge host name, if you're using secure delivery, that has a tie into which certificate that's going to be used. So keeping that in mind and using this particular API to do that, that's great. It kind of does everything for us. And remember, it's more of a subset of the other API. So if I had to sum up some of the differences, which I just did, you can choose these APIs based on your needs. Again, it's based on the type of environment you want to set up. With CPS, it's if you have more complex changes or more advanced changes that you need to make, then go ahead and use that API. Otherwise, the SPS API is something that's easier to use and easier to fit into a workflow. So that's Edge SSL certs with APIs in a nutshell. Now we're going to move on to the other component I mentioned with development. That's data center routing. How is the Edge going to go forward to your data centers, and what kind of rules can you set up there? And the APIs that you can use to do that is the traffic management API. And the great thing about using global traffic manager, either through portal or through APIs, is you can quickly add new data centers, you can quickly migrate to new environments in a very fast and safe way. And then lastly, you can maintain your current working environments, whether it be QA or production. You want those things to constantly work while maybe you test out new data centers or new environments that you're trying to bring on. So getting into, again, the life cycle, very similar to what we've been seeing. You have your standard phases. You create a new GTM configuration. You update those configurations, and then you deploy those changes. And again, with where the APIs fit in terms of that daily or weekly release cycle, the traffic management API is going to focus on that area. When it comes to traffic management, you have a few different options. You can use failover, IP intelligence, traffic distribution, and load balancing. And those are all different ways you can dictate how Akamai should go forward to your data centers. If we take a look at some examples of the actual APIs themselves, we have those standard capabilities. You can create the GTM configuration through APIs. You can update the GTM configuration, add new data centers, and then create new GTM properties. So in this case, you can add failover properties. You can reroute traffic from one data center to another on a percentage basis or on end user location basis, or just really on live feedback from the load of your data centers. So those are all different options, and that's something that is in Portal, but it's also through APIs that you can configure that and sort of fit that into your not only release cycle, but when you are making enhancements throughout your release cycles. So that was the traffic management component. Now, getting to the last component, I would say probably the most critical component, is the Edge configuration itself. How can we deploy Edge configurations in a fast way to get an environment going? Well, we can use the Property Manager API, and that allows us to quickly spin up test configurations, and we can deploy them fairly fast. We can onboard new properties, and again, you can maintain your working environments if it's QA, production, when you are making those changes. If we take a look again at that standard lifecycle, you have your create, you have your update, you have your deploy. When you are creating a delivery configuration, there's a couple of checks you need to have, Edge certs being one of them. So think about the way that I'm talking about each one of these components is in the order that you should consider setting up an environment. Once you have all those details in place, when it comes to updating the configuration, let's say you want to bring on a new environment, you can add host names, CP codes, origin rules there, caching rules, and so on. Really whatever you need to get an environment going. And then you deploy those changes with fast activation, which means you can push things out in 10 minutes or less. And we'll actually talk about that when we talk about deployment. But the main focus here is, where do the APIs fit in? Property Manager API will take care of that update deploy process that you can do or that you would need to do, again, on that daily or weekly recurring basis. You can use APIs to create the configuration as well, but it's more likely that you would need to make continuous updates to an existing configuration. If we look at an example or some of the behaviors that are available with the API, you have standard behaviors that you would see in Property Manager in Luna Portal. You can create an origin behavior, you can create CP codes, caching, compression rules, and so on. So there's behaviors for, and again I say almost everything. We're always adding new and new capabilities with APIs and in Portal. So just making sure you keep up with developer.akamai.com and then going through Property Manager itself in Portal will help you keep up to date. It's a one-step delivery configuration process. You can submit the whole configuration in one go, in one JSON body, and you have an environment already going. And then again, we have fast deployment. So these are all the different pieces that we think of as critical to setting up an environment. And throughout a lot of sessions at this conference, and I'm sure before this conference with your internal account teams, you've heard of these APIs or you've heard of these products. But what we wanted to do is kind of tie everything together and show you guys where this can fit into your life cycles. So we have our Edge Cert APIs, we have our traffic management APIs, and then you have your property manager APIs to give you that end-to-end development aspect. And then now that we've talked about development, we'll talk about the deployment piece.
All right. Thank you. So I'm going to start talking about deployment. I think when we start talking about deployment, there's really, a key aspect is always what I call a balance. There's always the speed versus control, right? So when we want to deploy, we like to deploy things fast. We like to just get things on right away. Now, on the other hand, how to be able to control the release, right? So I think for working, I work at Akamai, and I think I'm more qualified to talk about the importance of this. So Akamai, as you know, Akamai software runs on 250,000 servers, more or less. And we probably release software, pretty frequently, like any other, software company. But we want to make sure these software is of high quality, right? So we cannot just push everything out onto the, if something goes wrong, then Akamai will be out of business and will probably take many of our customers out of business as well. So we don't want that to happen. So this is very dear to our heart, and we treat this very seriously. So this is one aspect. The other one is availability, right? So it's nice to add new functionality to your app, but how do we make sure it's high availability, right? What happens if the feature doesn't work as well as we hoped, right? How do we be able to make sure it's not going to cause disruption to the business? So we want some kind of availability as well as redundancy. And then lastly is we want to have a seamless user experience. It's nice to, it's always nice to say, hey, I want to upgrade, but what happens if the user experience is impacted? What happens if the customer cannot check out? Or what happens if the speed becomes slow? What happens if their page weight increases? So we want to have all these things under check for doing the releases. So this is what I call from the lab to the field, right? So we can test things in the lab, but when we do the field, then it's a more complex consideration that we need to talk about. So first of all, I want to talk about the Cloudlet. How many of you knows about Cloudlet? Just show a hand. Yeah, most of you. So you know what Cloudlet is. It's very easy. You go to the marketplace and you just buy a Cloudlet or try it. And it's pretty easy. Like you just enable in the configuration, development configure. Then there's also a policy editor for the Cloudlet. You can add it. So this particular Cloudlet I want to talk about today is called phase release, right? So first of all, it's important to talk about Cloudlet because the Cloudlet logic is built into the edge. So what does that mean, right? So all the decision is being made on the edge. That means all these logic can be offloaded from your origin. So that's the first thing. And then what does this particular Cloudlet do is it basically gradually moving traffic over to a new deployed app, right? So when I say gradually, you have control over how much and when to move these traffic to the new application, right? From migrating application from one origin to another. So in the process, you can safely let your user to validate the new experience and functionality. So there's nice to test everything in the lab, but nothing beats when the user is actually able to test this and report back to you to see how the new functionality is like. So again, it's a similar point. Let the user basically testing this without affecting the entire customer base. So we have a particular customer is basically want to migrating their new application to the new application. So they basically want to gradually adding more and more user to the new application without migrating everything at once. And they basically want to say, if something goes wrong, I should be able to safely fall back to the original application. This is important. This policy activate under 1 minute. right? So I want to talk a little bit more about the policy, right? So those of you, I'm going to talk about the fast activation in a little bit. Cloudlet is unique because they have ability to, it's a segregation logic between, apart from the delivery configuration. So they have a concept of policy. So when you actually make a change, let's say I want to shift the traffic 5% to the new origin, all you need to do is just move the slide bar, click OK. Within 1 minute, 5 more, the more users migrate to the new origin. So this is important. So I know Sabrina already talked about the PAPI. So this is a policy for the Cloudlet policy. As you can see, this is going through the API as well. Very straightforward. You can create a policy. You can do create, update, retrieve, and activate, right? So the complete, again, goes back to the theme of this conference is everything, almost everything, you can do in the portal. Now you can do it through the API. And again, this API is very, very fast. It does it within under 1 minute. So that's great. So if something goes wrong and you want to roll it back, almost instant. Right? So just a little bit animation. I think you already got the point. Is how this Cloudlet works is, as you can see here, originally this is the original app. I have 100% traffic that's going to origin 1. And then I'm adding 15% of the traffic to the origin 2. Let's just assess how everything goes. Let's wait for the user to report back on how everything goes. If everything goes well, I hope, I'm adding more traffic to it. Now it's 60%. And of course, eventually, it's 100%, right? Then after that, you can choose to retire the Cloudlet, or you can use it again for the next release. Right. So this is phase release Cloudlet. You can kind of take a look. Now I want to talk about fast activation. Right. So I have been with Akamai for about 10 years. So that's quite long for Akamai tenure. So when I joined the company, to push out a configuration, it takes average 3 hours, believe it or not, right? 3 hours. Sometimes it might be even longer. On average, it's about 3 hours, right? So, so that's a big pain point, right? For me, so I work in professional service, so it's hard for me to serve my customer well, and it's also bad for a customer because who wants a 3-hour deployment? Now, there is a reason why it's 3 hours, right? Again, we have a large number of servers out there. Want to make sure the deployment is safe. We don't want to DOS our other customers. So there's a reason why the safety is built in. Out of the 3 hours, probably 2 hours and 45 minutes is for safety check, right? But a lot of enhancement has been put into the platform. So you heard from the keynote from Ash. The fast deployment right now is about 10 minutes on production and 3 minutes on staging. So that's a big improvement, right? Control, right? So I want to talk about that in a little bit more detail. It's nice to get the software out there ASAP, but what happens something goes wrong, right? What happens something goes wrong, you don't even know that thing has gone wrong. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So we do network safety checks. I want to talk a little bit more about that a little later. If something error increases, we'll automatically roll everything back. And there's also, we can instantly roll it back if we change our mind. Right? If something goes wrong, we know something goes wrong, hey, let's just roll it back instantly. Again, I want to go back to automation, say, everything we talk, Sabrina and I talk about here is done through either property manager or API. So this is a UI for a fast deployment, fast activation, not too much surprising here. You always want to turn it on. I don't see why you don't want to use it. Leave it on. I apologize if the font is a little small, but there's a checkbox down there. It says cancel activation if error increases, if the error rate increases. What this means is Akamai is able to do a snapshot comparison for before and after, right? So if we see your traffic, because we always roll out the change on some server first, then the later. So we actually take a look at the error rate within this server that's already has the new configuration. If there's like a spike in 500, 404, 400, then we automatically roll it back, right, without even you coming and request to roll back. So this is very helpful. It really saved our customer multiple times with this feature. So this is the automatic check that's built into the activation process. Then move on to Purge, right? So again, what is the use if you can cache stuff onto Akamai without purging? Again, I want to go back to the history. The purging takes time, right? So now we talk about fast purge. We talk about instant purge, right? So within a purge, within 5 seconds, you'll be able to purge your content. Now, additionally, before I'm sure all of you who manages the Akamai content, always purge by URL, or you have the option by CP code. Always treating purge by CP code with caution. Hopefully you never do that. But if you have to, you can purge by CP code. Now we have a new option. It's called purge by hashtag, right? You can control how you want to do batch purge. You can tag the request, tag the URL, and basically when you run the purge, you specify the tag. You can purge everything all at once, right? So that's pretty cool. It really gives you the flexibility, your control over how to purge. With instant purging, the other side benefit is you can cache longer, right? Why bother short TTL, right? You can really cache for, I wouldn't go as far as infinite, but you can really go caching for a long time because you have the ability to purge the content as needed, on demand. So that really, I always say caching is the best return on your investment. So Akamai invests millions of dollars, try to increase performance by 0.1 second. But if you can cache somewhere that's closer to the edge, that there's always a great benefit. So with the fast purge, we can able to cache longer and do better. And then lastly, it's the self-service management, right? Again, goes back to the API. Now, again, this is a JSON. As you can see, the fast purge API, pretty straightforward. You can request how to purge URL by specify that into the request body. Also, I include the purge, the v3 format here, and the response with you some ID, say the request has already been accepted and is being already proceed. Now, that's as much as deployment. I want to actually bring up another point, is the continuous testing, right? So this is an idea about, we talk about the development, we talk about CI, we talk about CD. I want to move a concept called CT, right? How is normally the way you testing application, right? Usually you don't, because you have to test your application behind the firewall. Your dev environment is not exposed to the internet, right? That's how you usually do. Now, that's pretty limited because you can only test that during the development stage. You basically hard to do, say, tests using, using a performance testing, and very little APM like Gomez, Dynatrace, New Relic has the ability to test application behind the logging, right? And if you have to test that on the internet, you have to work with your IT to expose the dev environment onto the DMZ. And we know that's hard, that's insecure. You're probably not going to be, InfoSec is probably not going to be very happy with you. But that's pretty much the only way you can do this. Now, I'm sure some of you already heard about with Tom's keynote, there's a new product we call Enterprise Application Access, right? So that really gives you the access solution, allow you to test application behind the firewall, right? So that really gives you the flexibility and ability to test your application during any development stages. And you can do that, set up multiple test environment. You have instant access to the development environment from anywhere. You can basically even let your user to do it and collect the source, the impulse beacons, and see how the performance is like, right? And again, I list some of the benefit here. I'm probably not going to go one by one, and it's also super I do want to point out it's very strong security compared with moving your application onto the DMZ or grant some kind of a VPN access to let people into the firewall. So the strong security allows you to integrate the solution with any kind of internal IDP, and it also provides the two-factor authentication. All right, so this is kind of the the diagram I put here, not only we can access application behind the firewall, we can also integrate that with the Akamai existing performance solution as well as security solution, right? So you can basically put in Ion or KSD in front of this application and really testing Akamai integration during your development, right? Like without waiting for the production release to integrate with the Akamai application, even during your development stage, you can test up Akamai caching rule and everything. So that's very beneficial, right? So I think kind of wraps up with our talk. Again, I would say, Akamai is really putting DevOps front and center. But there's already a lot of offhand tool that you can use to get it started. And hopefully, these tools, the stuff we talk about today, can help you with your everyday work to achieve the automation. With that, thank you for coming. I want to open, is there any questions from the audience? Yes. 10 minutes, yes. 3 minutes for staging, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, so the way it always works is Akamai push the software onto a number of servers, and when that's validated, that's confirmed, then we move on to the next stage to deploy onto more server. To answer your question, yeah, so within 10 minutes, all the server is going to be updated. Mm-hmm. The regression one and so
one group of big servers will have the latest version.
Yeah.
Another group will not keep going update, right?
Yeah.
So, that will have old version. So how do you keep the conflict and we are serving the real data then
Yeah. So I would say that's really not. It is possible that you actually have different server that's actually have different configuration. It's not, it's not a disruptive because at the end of the day, like Akamai is say if you want to move to origin, so it goes back to phase release, some people might be getting a little bit more like different server than the others. And the DNS is always going to be handing out IPs with some TTL. Right, so it's not like you're going to be request to request. You're going to be hitting different edge servers and get completely different experience. With a different configuration. So this phase, by pushing out the configuration onto different edge server, it shouldn't be a problem, right? Do you have a scenario that you think that might be a problem?
We did face it. That's what how we are handling that. That's my question. I'm surprised how we are handling. Not just we are just one customer. Probably we have hundreds of thousands of customers where the rollouts are happening on all the servers.
Yeah.
Forever. So how do you handle that without affecting the customer, all those servers?
I would say, at least during the integration process, because I've heard that concern as well. We usually try to take that into account. So even before we got it down to 10-minute production push, I think it was an hour before. It's an hour. Mm-hmm. Even during then, some servers are getting a version of the update, and then some aren't necessarily updated right away. Right? It's a slow progression, and if you are deploying changes, that's something we can keep in mind. But again, it shouldn't be anything that's disruptive. It really just depends on the logic that you're pushing out. We have taken that into consideration. For example, when we had, super specific example, we had pushed out changes behind some sort of header behind like a cookie, and it was dropped on some servers, but it wasn't dropped on others. It wasn't necessarily disruptive, but it was just a, hey, just so you know. That's how things are rolling out. Yeah.
No, it's not a separate CDN. I would say that's the CDN that we can use like for if you want to use staging, that's fine. If you want to use the production, that's fine. It's for dev purpose, right? So basically integrating your dev environment with production CDN. So it's not a separate CDN. Yeah.
Yeah, so as far as best practices go, and just to kind of get changes going out, I mean, I've seen multiple approaches to this, but having something separate for your test environments is always great. You don't have to touch those production certs, and using something like a wildcard, maybe you don't need to continuously update them and even have to bother with the APIs. So wildcard it if you can. Any more questions? So you're saying an example of one of the APIs that you would submit, or? Mm-hmm.
This is what we have done. You guys can basically pay whatever basically automate that same thing in the processes.
So I think everything on the API we provided here, like some of the screenshots, you should be able to find testing. You should be able to test and with references into developer.akamai.com. So that actually has a lot of example code and standard. Yeah.
Those are all pieces of puzzle. My point was one full working area where we can take a look at it. It's just like, old completed project where we can just take a reference to and basically try to build a processes by looking at it as an example.
Yeah, I don't think we have anything. I mean, we could write a blog post about it.
Yeah.
And kind of walk you guys through the steps for the whole setting up exactly what we talked about. But I don't think we have anything in place today that is focused on what we talked about. Contract questions? It's definitely, I mean, ultimately it's traffic. If you're running like ongoing load testing, I'm sure it'll count towards, but if it's something you're just testing very not as often, shouldn't contribute too much to contract usage.
It's just
Talk to your internal account team.
Yeah. I would say it's a little similar. I would say, yeah, so there's a little similar. I think over the year, I think there's in terms of control, in terms of the functionality, but application load balance, it's very similar. I think one is the successor for the other by introducing some more edge logic, like more control over in terms of cookie, like more option in terms of how do you manage those session stickiness cookie. But the concept and the functionality is similar. Yeah. Yeah, I would say if you look at this diagram, right? So with the EA connector, the application behind the firewall, it's really just as far as Akamai is concerned, it's just an origin, right? Because EA allows you to have access to the application, right? So, excuse me. Then basically Akamai can basically point to the origin and have instant access to the application. Yeah, so you still need a ION configuration, basically specify the caching rule and everything, and by pointing to the origin. Yeah.
In this case, will there be multiple configurations where each and every one will be having a different origin, like one for dev, one for dev 2, one for dev 3?
Yeah. I would say for you can always put in multiple hostname inside a single Akamai configuration. So it's not necessary you will have a different configuration, but you can have different test host names.
You can, map it to different host names or
Each
even
of-
use
yeah.
something else in the request to sort of manage which endpoint you want to go to. Did you-
What was the
How
question?
is EA contracted?
How is EA contracted? I think EA is going to be on the marketplace pretty soon, so you can actually try that out to make it very easy. I would say any kind of a contract-related question, you can always contact the account.
Basically.
Say it again. Yeah, you have multiple. Yeah, I would say I think the EA, the way the model is actually number of users. Yeah, so it's not like I'm not too familiar with the contract structure, but yeah, so it's a lot usage-based contract. Yeah, thank you.
Or find them here today.
All right. With that, our time is up. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.